Hello everyone and welcome back to Just Finish Coding. I'm Sriram and this video is the third part of the Jetpack Hero game development series. In case you've not watched parts 1 and 2, there will be a card for you right here. By the end of this video, you will have the scoring system as well as the missile movement set up. With these things in place, the game will be ever closer to completion. We can start with the scoring system. The costumes of the 3 clones of the score sprite, which are numbers from 0 to 9, will be taking on the values of the individual score digits. At this point, we don't even have the score being stored in a variable, so let's do that first. When the green flag is clicked, we initialize a variable for all sprites called score. We have to set this to 0 at the beginning. Next, we create a variable for the sprite only called clone ID. Like I mentioned earlier, there'll be 3 clones of the sprite. We need to be able to distinguish between these clones so that each clone can represent graphically the value of a different score digit. This variable will do exactly that. At the beginning, we set clone ID to 0. We are only showing the clones so we can hide the sprite as well. After this, we have a repeat 3 times. Each time we change clone ID by 1 and then create a clone. Since we have set clone ID to be for this sprite only, each clone will have its own copy of the clone ID variable. Now that variable will have the value of the clone ID of the sprite at the exact moment the clone was created. When the first clone is created, its clone ID will be 1. When the second clone is created, its clone ID will be 2. When the third clone is created, its clone ID will be 3. At the end of this, we can set the clone ID back to 0. This will be the clone ID of the default sprite, and this is where we can make the score changes. Next, we can move on to the thumbnail event. Here we can initialize a variable called playerAlive for the sprite only and set it to no. When the game is going on, this variable will have its value as yes. When the player dies and we are at the intro screen, its value will be no. Remember that the thumbnail message signifies that the intro screen is showing. At this point, the score should be hidden, and this is why we set the variable to no. The game starts when the start message is received, so here we set playerAlive to yes. We want to constantly increase the score, but we have to be a bit careful. We have to keep in mind that there are 3 clones on top of the sprite which receive this message. If we just change score by 1, the sprite as well as the clones will perform this operation, and instead of changing score by 1, we will end up changing score by 4. To make sure that this doesn't happen, we have an additional conditional check if the clone ID is 0. This will only be true of the sprite. If we set the score to 0 and keep increasing the score until playerAlive turns to no, the clones will not act on this. Of course, just leaving the code like this will make the score increase extremely fast, so we have to limit it. After increasing the score by 1, we make the sprite wait for a second before doing it again. Okay, so that will be all the things that we have to do with our score variable, and now we have to ensure that the clones graphically represent their values. So when the clones form, we'd want them to go to the top left of the screen. The Y position will be a constant of 158, but the X position will vary depending on which digit of the score the clone is representing. If the clone is representing the first digit, it will be on the left. If the clone is representing the second digit, it will be in the middle, and if the clone is representing the third digit, it will be on the right. In net, we need to have an extreme X value of minus 242 plus clone ID multiplied by 23. 23 is simply the width of each costume, and this is done to make sure that the clones do not collide. After this, we set the size to 100 and the brightness effect to 100 as well. Brightness controls how white an image is. A value of 0 means that the image will retain its costume color, while a value of 100 means that all parts of the image will be completely white. We can now show the clone and enter into the main forever loop. At this point, we have to come up with a way to filter out the clones. Some clones may have to be hidden and others shown depending upon what the score is. For example, if the score is 45, then the clones with clone ID 1 and clone ID 2 should show, while the clone with clone ID 3 should hide. If the score has only one digit, then only the clone with clone ID 1 should show while the remaining clones hide. This way we get a pattern. If the score variable has an n number of digits, the clones which have their clone ID either equal to n or less than n should show. Instead of a less than or equal to, we can simplify this expression further. If clone ID -1 is less than the number of digits, we show the clone. So, getting back to the Scratch code, if clone ID -1 is less than the length of score, we switch its costume to letter clone ID of score and then show the clone. If this is not the case, we hide the clone. The length function basically gives us the number of digits in the score variable. Alright, that's all we need to do for the score sprite. If you test out the program now, the score variable should function as intended. Let's now move on to the rockets. We wouldn't want any of them showing on the intro screen, so when the thumbnail message is received, we hide the sprite. When the game starts, we can use the sprite to create missile clones. Within a forever loop, we create a clone and then give a random time lag of 0.5 to 1.5 seconds. Okay, let's move on to the clone script. We initially want the clone to go to the right end of the screen and then move to the left. The X value is going to be a fixed 210, but for the Y value we can add some variation by setting it to a random value from -160 to +160. Before we proceed, I think it is important to give an overview of how the missile system would work. If you take a look at the costumes tab, you will see that there are two costumes, Warning and Rocket. The user first sees the Warning costume on the right end of the stage. The costume will mirror the player's own movements, which means that if the player moves up or down, the Warning costume will do the same as well. After a few seconds, the clone switches its costume to the Rocket. The rocket then moves across the screen and disappears when it completes its path. To get this as intended, we first set the size to 100, then switch costume to Warning, then set ghost effect to 100 and then show. What we're trying to achieve with the ghost effect and size is a simple animation. The actual size of the Warning costume needs to only be about 30, but we set it to 100 initially and then swiftly reduce it the same way we did in the intro screen. Let's actually implement that. Within a repeat 10, we change size by 30 minus size divided by 3. Next, we change ghost effect by -10 so that at the end of this repeat, the clone will be completely visible. At this point, we have to make sure that the Warning costume mirrors the player's position and eventually becomes the rocket. For the first 30 times, we can have the Warning costume mirror the Y position of the player. In case the Warning costume is already horizontal to the player, we would want it to stay in that position. So within the if-then statement, we check if the absolute value of Y position of player minus Y position is greater than 3. If this is the case, then it means the clone has to move. But we have to figure out whether it should move up or move down. If the Y position of the player is greater than the Y position of the clone, then we have to move up. We wouldn't want an instant mirroring, otherwise it would be near impossible to finish the level. So each time this is the case, we change Y by +1, and if this is not the case, change Y by -1. After the repeat loop, the clone's costume will have to switch to the rocket, and the rocket will then move across the screen. To make sure that the rocket does not pile up at the edge, we have to use the same size method that was done for the other sprites. We have to first set size to 400 and then change X by 70. The reason we change X by 70 is because we want it to appear as if the rocket is coming in from the right end of the screen. It's gonna look a bit odd if the rocket suddenly appears where the Warning was. Alright, now we can finish the size change by setting size to 40 and then switching the costume to rocket. These steps should be pretty self-explanatory. Now we'd want the rockets to keep moving to the left, but not forever. There are two cases when we'd want to stop the rocket. The process can go on until the rocket is touching the player or the X position is less than -300. Within the repeat until loop, we can use the size changes again as we're dealing with the movement. We can start by setting size to 400. It's very easy to make all the rockets move at a constant speed throughout the game, as we just have to change X by some constant number. Rather than doing this, however, we can make the game a little bit more fun by increasing the difficulty as the score goes up. We can change x by 0 minus 10 plus score divided by 5. Since the rocket moves towards the left, we have to change x by a negative value. At the start, when the score is close to 0, the rocket will move to the left by 10 pixels. As the score gets higher and higher, the rocket moves faster and faster, and this is the result we want. The next thing we have to do is restore the size. So we add a change size to 40. After the rocket has completed its path, we can hide it by setting the ghost effect to 0. After a small wait lag of 0.1 seconds, we can delete the clone. And that is going to be everything that you have to do for this video. If you test out the program, the warning signs and the rocket system should work perfectly. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a like, and also don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.